Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Second Language Acquisition class. So our material today is about Information Processing Theory, (SLA). So first of all, let's distinguish between recall versus recognition. All right, so when we use the word recall, it means that we retrieve information from our memory. So for example, when we want to do a fill in the blank questions, to be able to answer the question, we have to retrieve the right information from our memory to answer the question. Or when we want to do an essay task. So when we want to write an essay, we have to retrieve information, the necessary information from our memory to be able to write an essay, for example. Okay, now what about recognition? So recognition is the activity when we identify the target information from possible targets. So for example, when we do multiple choice tests. So when we do multiple choice tests, there are several choices. So we have to recognize which one is the correct answer. So that's the information that we need in that case, right? So that's recognition. Okay. So that's the difference between recall and recognition, which will be used later when we talk about information processing theory. Okay, next is about information processing theory. So what is information processing theory? So this theory describes the process of information being received, processed, and stored in the human brain and the way it is retrieved. The information processing theory is an approach to the cognitive development of a human being, which deals with the study and the analysis of the sequence of events that occur in a person's mind while receiving some new piece of information. This theory recognizes the ability for a person to control what information is processed and the changes and development of these abilities. So what is the relation to second language acquisition? So when we learn a new language or when we learn a second language, we receive new information, right? And then the new information is processed and then stored. And when we want to use the language, the information is then retrieved from our memory. So that's why in SLA, we also learned about information processing theory to understand how we receive information and then the brain process and stored the information in our brain. Okay. Next is about the core principle of information processing theory. Okay, now let's discuss about the three-step process in information processing theory. So the first step is encoding. So what is it? So encoding involves the initial processing of information where sensory information is transformed into a form that can be stored in memory. And then after that, if the information is important, then it will be retained. The information will be retained. So we go to the next step, the storage. So the storage is the retention of information over time, and retrieval involves the recovery of information from memory when needed for use in cognitive processing. Then the last step is retrieval or automatization. So in this step, it is the process of getting the information out of memory storage so that it can be used when we need the information. So for example, when we solve a problem in a task, or when we want to answer a question, making a decision, or performing a task. So that will involve retrieving the necessary information from our brain. All right. So next is about the three key memory systems in memory processing. The first one is sensory memory. So sensory memory is the initial stage of memory processing, where sensory information is briefly retained in its original form. So it refers to what we are experiencing through our senses at any given moment. So this includes what we can see, what we can hear, touch, taste, or smell. So this is the first step of memory processing, yeah, when we receive new information from our senses. So for example, when we see something, when we hear something, touch something, and so on. The next system is short-term memory or working memory. So this is a temporary storage system that allows for the active manipulation and use of information in the short term. So working memory is essential for our everyday life because it allows for the temporary storage of information. For example, when we receive new information of a phone number, for example, when we want to memorize a phone number. So the short-term memory will keep it until it is no longer needed. The next system is long-term memory. So for long-term memory, it is more permanent. So it's a permanent storehouse of information that can be retrieved and used for cognitive processing. So long-term memory is where information is stored for longer periods of time. Potentially, the long-term memory can also retain information for a lifetime if the information is encoded effectively. All right. Okay, so next is about the differences of each memory system in terms of duration, capacity, and function. The first one, for sensory memory, the duration is less than 1 second. The capacity is very large, so we can receive many information at the same time. The function is for initial processing of sensory input. The second one, working memory, the duration is from 15 to 30 seconds. The capacity is 5 to 9 items, and the function is for conscious processing and manipulation of information. The last one, the last system is long-term memory. So the duration is more long-lasting compared to two systems. And then the capacity is unlimited. So it is a permanent storage for later retrieval of use of information. Okay, so next is about the limited capacity of working memory. So working memory is the memory system in our brain that allow us to process a small amount of information for a short period of time. So this memory system is very important in our everyday life. We use it for learning, we use it for problem solving, we use it for decision making. However, this memory system has a limited capacity because it can only retain information for a short period of time, right? So, okay, so because of the limited capacity of working memory, so there are some strategies that we can do to support the working memory, especially in SLA. So most people can hold about 5 to 9 chunks of information in the working memory. Even in modern studies suggest that the working memory can process information to just 4 or 5 items, especially for complex information. So what are the strategies? So what we can do to help the working memory in processing the information, the first activity is chunking. So uh, we can divide the information, especially for complex information, into several short information. So it will be easier to process. Yeah, the information will be easier to process. The second one is by doing repetition or recycling. So we repeat the information over and over again, or by using visual aids like picture, video, and so on, yeah, and also using scaffolding, or give more time for our system to process the information. Or we can also simplify the input. So simple input usually is easier to process. Okay, so next is about how information is processed in our brain. So this flowchart describes how information is processed in our brain. So when we get information from the environment, the information will be received by our sensory memory. So for example, when we see something, when we touch something, sense something, smell something, and so on. Yeah. If the information uh, is considered important, then it will be transferred to the next system. If it is not, then most likely the information will be forgotten. So if the information is transferred into the short-term memory, then again, it will be processed. Yeah, if the information is needed for longer use, then it will be transferred to long-term memory. If we no longer need the information will be forgotten. So the information that is transferred into long-term memory, it will be stored in our brain for longer period. And later, when we need the information, uh, then it will be retrieved. So we can use the information again as necessary. Okay, so this is the process of how the information is stored, and retrieved for longer use. All right, so next is about controlled versus automatic processing. So these terms describe two different ways the brain handles information. The first one, controlled processing, is conscious, effortful, and slow process of information processing. So for example, it is used when learners are first learning a language, rule, or forms. So it involves thinking carefully about what to say or write. It is also highly dependent on working memory. The second processing is automatic processing. So for automatic processing is unconscious, uh, usually faster and effortless. Uh, this processing happens after extensive practice and exposure. So it requires little to no mental effort. All right. So next is about stages of information processing in SLA. The first one is input. Yeah. So for the input, usually the linguistic data that learners are exposed to, such as spoken or written language. So the input must be a comprehensible input that is slightly above the learner's current proficiency level. And then the second step is noticing. So this is the step where learners consciously uh, become aware of the specific linguistic features in the input they are exposed to. For example, a learner noticed the ed ending used for past tense in English. Okay, the next step is intake. So intake is the portion of input that a learner actively processes and uses for building their grammatical knowledge and language system. So intake is different from raw input. So the intake is what the learner actually internalizes. And then the next steps is processing or working memory. So in this step, the learner holds the notice information temporarily and tries to make sense of it, relating the information to the existing knowledge. There are some strategies that can be used in these steps, usually, for example, by chunking or grouping information, or by rehearsal, practicing again and again using the noticed information, or by comparison. So, for example, comparing the learned language with their L1, or with previously learned L2 items. Okay, next step is short-term storage and practice. So in this step, learners may store some information temporarily and practice it through output. So for example, using speaking or writing. And then the next step is long-term storage or restructuring. So in this stage, information that is processed deeply enough gets stored in long-term memory. So there are some processes in these steps, such as restructuring. So the learners revise their interlanguage system to accommodate new rules or forms. And then the next process is automatization. So with repeated use, language become faster and more automatic. So in this stage, the learners can reach a more fluent level of learning language. Next is retrieval and output. So learners retrieve in this stage, learners retrieve stored language knowledge to use it in communication, for example, through speaking or writing. Related to the fluency and accuracy, it will be dependent on the strength and the automaticity of the stored representation. So the fluency and accuracy will be different from each students. Yeah, so the students, so each students will have their own fluency and accuracy level. And this is also where feedback can be helpful, because feedback will help refine and consolidate learning further in this stage. Okay, so the last slide is the end of the material. And the next slide, starting from this slide, is the exercise or the assignments that you need to do. So the first one, for example, match column A with column B. So for column A, the type of processing, controlled and automatic processing, and column B is this description. So which description match controlled processing and which description match the automatic processing. The next exercise is to match the term input, noticing, intake, and so on with the definition in the next column. For this exercise, you need to answer the questions based on what we have learned so far. Okay, so this is the end then of our meeting today. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next time.